Welcome back to week 6 of the Sermon on the Mount series. We are just about halfway through our series, even though we're just approaching the end of the first chapter of Jesus' teaching here. Now, this last section of Jesus' teaching in Matthew chapter 5, verses 38 through 48, they could be the hardest part of the Sermon on the Mount. I think very easily they could be the hardest part of the Sermon on the Mount. Why? Jesus is setting the bar very high for his followers in this section. Jesus, he's going to keep talking about peace. Jesus is going to keep talking about peace. Peace in what it means to love our enemies. Peace in what it means to approach other people when they've harmed us and how we're called to respond to that. Jesus raises the bar. He challenges us once again. It's going to be a hard, challenging week. It was for me as I looked at it, and I hope it challenges you. Jesus keeps talking about peace. And anybody who thinks that Jesus doesn't care about this, Jesus cares deeply about justice and peace. He talks all about it in this sermon. It's all over the place in this longest teaching from him. Jesus is all about the way of peace. And we got to figure out how then we live that out in our lives. Now, Jesus begins and he talks about the statement, or really the code set in the Old Testament that said, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. That seems harsh. That's just like, you do something to me, I'd take something from you. But what we have to realize is that in the original context, the original eye for an eye statement, it limited revenge. Eye for an eye limited revenge. Because you see, here's something that I've said before and I'll say it again. We are broken people. We are broken, sinful people. And so naturally, if somebody responds and sins against us, our natural sinful response a lot of times will be to take our revenge to the next level. And so somehow, even in this somewhat broken code of the Old Testament, it limits the revenge that one person would give to another person for an action done against them. But Jesus, we're going to see, Jesus raises the bar in love. He raises the bar in what it means to love others. He takes it to the next level. He says, I'm not calling you just to limit your sinful desires, your sinful responses, your sinful actions, but I'm actually calling you to look more like God. Jesus raises the bar from saying, just don't let your sinful humanity get out of control. And he raises the bar and says, look like me, follow me, look like God, live like Jesus, live in the way of peace. We aren't just non-sinners, we're Jesus followers. And Jesus' followers are called to look and act differently. Jesus then brings up 3 very famous sayings, the first of which is probably the most famous. Turn the other cheek. We're supposed to give our shirt to someone else, and we're actually called to go the extra mile. And all of these things are a part of Jesus' third way. That's the next one. All a part of Jesus' third way. A lot of times turning the other cheek can feel like you're just receiving more violence from somebody, or giving them your shirt when they've already asked from you, or going an extra mile when you didn't even want to go the first mile. But all of these are a part of Jesus' third way. In that day and age, if someone was slapping you on your right cheek, they would have been using the back of their left hand. And their left hand, their less dominant hand, was to treat you as inferior to them. If they slapped you on the right cheek, they were calling you inferior to them. And what does Jesus say? Jesus says, turn the other cheek. And when turning the other cheek, they would then have to take their right hand if they were to slap you again. And in a sense, Jesus is saying, turn the other cheek, force them to use their dominant hand, which is the only hand they would use to hit someone who is their equal. In Jesus' third way, he's saying, when somebody sins against you, you call them to view your humanity and how they've sinned. Instead of sinning back against them, you're not just receiving more sin, you're actually called to a third way that says, look at me, see my humanity. The same thing holds true in giving the shirt and going the extra mile. They are all ways of calling the people who had already called something from you to see that in asking more of you, they were doing an injustice towards you. The way of peace is about calling us to let others see their need for justice in each and every situation. Peace and justice go hand in hand in the way Jesus calls us to live here. Now Jesus goes onward, and he says the way, it's about justice. Absolutely, it's a third way, it's a different way, but it's all a completely different way, because Jesus, the very next thing is he says, you've heard it said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy, but I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Jesus says we should love our enemies. And I say, what? That seems absolutely crazy. How can we seriously take the fact that we are called to love people that are our enemies? Does it only apply in certain situations, or is Jesus actually calling us to look more like God? You know, we think maybe it just applies in certain situations. I think Jesus is saying you're called to look and to live more like I do, and look and live more like God did. Because here's what it says in the book of Romans. It says, for if while we were God's enemies, we were reconciled to him through the death of his Son, Jesus, how much more, having been reconciled, shall we be saved through his life? While we were God's enemies, Jesus died for us. Jesus showed us the incredible, astounding, oceanic, unbelievable love of the cross while we were enemies of him. We were sinners, enemies of God. And Jesus loved us through it. He loved his enemies, so to speak. And he calls us to do the same. He says, you now follow me and you look like me because you love your enemies. You love your enemies. And not only do you love your enemies, but you pray for those who persecute you. You pray for those who are persecuting you. And that seems equally astounding here, that not only are we called to love them, but we're called to pray for them. Because here is something that is absolutely true. Prayer is an intimate action. The action of prayer, it's totally intimate. To go before God on behalf of another person, that is daringly intimate. To lift up another person to the throne of God in prayer is something that is incredibly meaningful. And when we pray for another person, we see that they are made in the image of God, loved by God, and we call on God to bless them, to acknowledge them. That is a grandiose action. Praying for people who persecute you is quite astounding. It is totally astounding. But Jesus calls us to it. He says, pray for those who persecute you. And when we love like Jesus, we expect nothing in return. We love our enemies, we pray for people who persecute us, and we expect nothing in return. What did Jesus receive when he went and showed us the incredible love on the cross? He heard shouts from the crowd that said, crucify him. There's a song that I love by a band that's based here in Orange County. They were back in the 90s, a ska band. They were called the OC Supertones. And their line is that my sin yelled crucify louder than the mob that day. Though the mob yelled crucify Jesus very, very loud, the fact that I sinned and I continued to sin against God, my sin also yelled crucify. Crucify him. And yet Jesus, even though I'm his enemy in that, he loved me. He loves you enough to go to the cross. He loved his enemies through the cross, and he expected nothing from us in return. And now we're called to follow him in this. We're called to follow him in loving our enemies, even if we don't know if they will respond in love back to us. Loving our enemies, and this is the last point for the day, it doesn't mean simply tolerating them. Loving my enemies does not mean tolerance. It means active prayer and outreach. Active prayer and outreach. Loving our enemies here, Jesus says, he calls us, we're to pray for people that persecute us. Jesus says we are called to be peacemakers. We reach out. We make intimate actions like prayers with other people. Love is not just a noun. Love is a verb. And it doesn't mean we just tolerate enemies. We reach out to them in love. We reach out to them with prayer. We don't just not do bad things. We do good things. That's what loving our enemies means. Praying for those people who persecute us. Calling us to love with action. So I know that that's challenging. And I know that you'll have a lot to talk about this week about what that might mean to love our enemies. But it all begins with prayer, praying for people who persecute us. And that is a challenging call. So let's together walk in this challenging way of Jesus and realize that we were loved by God when we were his enemies. And now we're called to look like and live like Jesus in the same way.